Welcome to the Geek, the History Geek. I'm Mr. Hodges. You have been at war for nearly 10 years. Your progress has been slow, and you have not been able to secure a final victory against the Chinese. To gain a strategic advantage, you invade the French possession of Indochina, only to be dealt a series of economic sanctions that are aimed at crippling your war effort. What do? If you're Japan, you choose an audacious plan that will widen the scope of the war and bring near certainty that the U.S. will join the war. Stay with me as we explore the history of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the recognition of Pearl Harbor Day. In September of 1931, the Japanese, in violation of its treaty obligations, occupied Manchuria in northeast China. Seeking to gain raw materials to fuel its growing industries and industrialization, the Japanese used an incident where an explosive device was planted next to the railroad tracks near Mukden as an excuse to seize all of the cities along the rail line. At the same time, the Japanese forces left occupied Korea and proceeded to seize all of the major cities in Liaoning and Kirin provinces. By February of 1932, the Chinese were forced to surrender all of Manchuria to the Japanese forces. Over the next few years, the Japanese continued to seize territory, taking advantage of a war between the Chinese Communists and the Chinese National Forces. In 1936, this would change, and by 1937, the Chinese would begin to fight in a united front and begin to oppose Japan by any means. In late 1937, the Japanese would begin their brutal assault on the city of Nanjing, which would result in widespread destruction of the city, the targeting of Chinese civilians by both air attacks and brutal massacres and war crimes. During this attack, a U.S. naval vessel, the USS Panay, and 3 other U.S. ships would come under attack. The Japanese apologized for the incident and paid the U.S. for the loss of the ships and for the loss of life. The war would continue slowly with the Japanese advances into China until reaching a stalemate in 1939. In an attempt to break the stalemate, the Japanese would take advantage of the 1940 defeat of the French by the Germans to take possession of the French possession of Indochina. These incidents had been increasing the tensions between the U.S. and Japan, however, with the invasion of Indochina and then the joining of Japan with the European Axis powers of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The U.S. began to step up its sanctions in an attempt to end the fighting. The U.S. began a series of embargoes to stop the shipment of raw materials that would help the Japanese war effort. This would include things like copper and lead, petroleum products, aluminum, and even scrap metals. In addition, any items or products that could be used to help the Japanese war effort were also banned. As events escalated, the most crippling sanctions were the ending of all trade with Japan, the seizure of Japanese financial assets in the U.S., and the cutting off of all oil shipments to Japan. All of these were very serious, but Japan, who had to import 90% of its oil, would not have the oil to continue the war against the Chinese. This infuriated the Japanese leaders. Even before this moment, the Japanese leaders had recognized the tensions between the U.S. and Japan building and knew they were likely on a collision course. In January 1940, Admiral Yamamoto sent an idea to the Japanese Naval Minister Oikawa to plan an attack on the U.S. The Japanese began the planning, preparation, and practice to carry out this possible future attack. Somehow, the U.S. ambassador in Japan, Joseph Grew, had heard that an attack on U.S. forces in Hawaii was possible, and on January 27th, he wired Washington, D.C. that there was a high likelihood that Japan was planning to attack Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately, the idea was immediately dismissed because they believed that the Philippines would be the most likely target for Japanese attack. In November 1941, the Japanese leaders determined that it could not afford to back down from U.S. demands. They chose to begin negotiations with the U.S., and at the same time, they began to plan an attack on the U.S. and the attacks that would also follow in their wake. Due to the fact that the Pacific sees a monsoon season, the attack date against Pearl Harbor was set for early December 1941. The decision to attack the U.S. came in early November 1941 and this only left about 4 weeks to finalize the attack plans and to hopefully reach a critical negotiated decision with the U.S. to avoid war. Unknown to the Japanese, U.S. intelligence services, using Project Magic, had actually broken the Japanese diplomatic codes. They knew from intercepted messages that Japan was planning an attack, but they did not know where or against whom. On November 26, 1941, the U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull reiterated the U.S. position regarding Japanese actions in China and across Asia, and demanded that they withdraw from both Indochina and China. This was unacceptable to the Japanese. Over the next 2 days, the Japanese Imperial Navy ordered naval vessels to begin to leave ports in the Kuril Islands and head out to sea from several locations. These would form up in the Northwest Pacific to form the Japanese task force known as Kido Butai, which was under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagomu. This battle group of 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, and other supporting ships would form the battle group that would attack Pearl Harbor. Under strict radio silence, they would begin to sail across more than 3,800 miles of the Pacific Ocean. The last chance to avoid war with the U.S. came on December 1st when the Japanese emperor met with the Japanese cabinet. The cabinet voted in favor of war, and the emperor agreed. The final die was cast. On December 6th, U.S. intelligence, using Project Magic, intercepted Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's response sent to Japanese Ambassador Nomura in Washington, D.C., regarding U.S. Secretary of State Hull's conditions. On December 7th, more messages came in from Prime Minister Tojo. He instructed the Japanese consulate to destroy their code machine and to deliver the official Japanese response to the U.S. Secretary of State at exactly 1 p.m. Washington, D.C. time, which coincidentally would be exactly 7:30 a.m. in Oahu in Hawaii. Due to a delay, the Japanese ambassador would not be able to meet until 2:30 p.m. By this time, the message would be delivered too late. Events on that fateful Sunday began at 3:42 a.m. when a U.S. minesweeper spotted what it believed to be a sub heading toward Pearl Harbor. It notified the destroyer USS Ward, but did not notify anyone else. At 6 a.m., over 230 miles north of Oahu, the first wave of the Japanese attack began to take off from the Japanese carriers. At approximately 6:45 a.m., the USS Ward spotted and fired upon a sub, which it hit and sunk. The Ward quickly radioed in about the sinking of the sub. A few minutes later, on the north side of the island of Oahu, the Army radar station detected a large number of incoming planes. This would be called in, but it would not be acted upon right away. A later return call would tell them that it was likely a large group of U.S. B-17 bombers that they were expecting to arrive that morning. No alarm would be sounded. About the same time the radar station is detecting the incoming planes, the USS Ward detects another sub and uses depth charges to destroy it. The Ward again radios in about the second sub. However, still no alarm is raised. At virtually the same time, over 200 miles north of Oahu, the Japanese would launch their second wave of attack aircraft. The first wave, led by Captain Fuchida, would reach land around 7:30 a.m. and begin forming their attack positions. As they closed to attack, he broke radio silence to shout, "Tora, Tora, Tora." This meant Tiger, 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 and indicated to the attacking aircraft that surprise had been achieved. The first wave's attack would begin around 7:55 a.m. and would simultaneously attack Hickam, Wheeler, Kanoe, Ava, and Ford Island air stations. Other planes would begin to attack the ships anchored at Pearl Harbor. Nearly an hour later, at 8:54 a.m., as the first group began to break off their attack to head back, the second wave Japanese aircraft began their attack. The Japanese attacks would last for just over 2 hours and would leave destroyed aircraft, damaged and sunken ships, blazing fires, and death and devastation in their wake. The planned third Japanese attack wave never happened. Despite having only lost 29 planes, Admiral Nagumo would override Admiral Yamamoto's plan and will call off the planned third strike. He was concerned about the fleet's low fuel status and the fact that any attacks now would not be made with the same level of surprise and therefore would not likely be as successful. More importantly, he was concerned about the fact that the American carriers were not here at Pearl Harbor, they had not been sunk, and that they might already be hunting his force for a retaliatory strike. The attack at Pearl Harbor was part of a much larger planned offensive where the Japanese made simultaneous attacks all over Southeast Asia and the islands. The major focus was to knock the U.S. out of the war by focusing on the U.S. Air Forces at the Philippines. Within the next few weeks, they would take Thailand, attack Malaya, and take Singapore, and occupy British Hong Kong. In addition, they would attack and seize U.S. possessions of Guam, Wake Island, and the Gilbert Islands as they worked to eliminate U.S. bases and links with the Philippines. Once this is done, they would begin their attack to take over the Philippines and sweep through the various resource-rich islands of the Pacific, leaving the Japanese masters of a huge swath of territory. The Japanese had hoped that they could damage the U.S. fleet so severely that the attack on Pearl Harbor that the U.S. would be forced to not be able to respond. However, with the U.S. carrier forces that were not present at Pearl Harbor, and with the new ships that were being built by the U.S. to prepare for the possibility of war, the Japanese had failed to deal the crippling blow that they had hoped for. They had made several important mistakes and misjudgments. The Japanese had sunk 4 battleships, damaged 4 additional battleships, and heavily damaged 9 other vessels. They destroyed 188 aircraft and damaged another 159. 2,335 servicemen would be killed and 1,143 wounded in the attack. They thought that this defeat would demoralize the U.S. They misjudged the U.S. desire to stay out of the war as weakness. This was a major mistake. So was the failure to finish the job at Pearl Harbor. Despite all the destruction, the Japanese failed to destroy the critical oil tanks and fuel stores there at the base, as well as the important ammunition stores and the ship repair facilities. This was a critical error. Eventually, all but 3 of the ships that were sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor would be repaired, and they would see combat against the Japanese Imperial forces during World War II. In addition, the Japanese deceit due to the fake negotiations and the failure to deliver the declaration of war prior to the attack outraged many Americans. The very next day, President Franklin Roosevelt would address a joint session of Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Japan. His famous speech very accurately portrayed the feeling of Americans. Both houses of Congress would vote for war with only 1 dissenting vote. The strike at Pearl Harbor backfired on the Japanese as it had united the American public and gave them extra incentive to see the war through to the very end, regardless of the cost. Many would volunteer to fight, and many others here at home would work round the clock to produce the things needed for the war. This would ultimately lead to the defeat of the Japanese. Today, we pause to honor the sacrifices of the servicemen and to honor the fallen. We pause to remember the events of Sunday, December 7th, 1941, on Pearl Harbor Day. This holiday was signed into law from a joint resolution by President Bill Clinton on August 23, 1994. On November 29, 1994, President Clinton issued a proclamation declaring December 7th, 1994, the first National Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day. As we honor those who died as a result of the attack, we should be sure that the American flag is flown at half-staff until sunset. So now you know a little bit about the origins and the history behind the attack at Pearl Harbor, and about the Day of Recognition too. For those visiting Hawaii and the island of Oahu, I urge you to visit the USS Arizona Memorial and to see the wreckage of this great battleship below the waves, and also to pay your respects to the sailors still entombed aboard. Pause and consider the courage of our Americans of the past that were thrust into a difficult situation, refused to give up, and fought back against an aggressor despite overwhelming odds. I encourage you to share this video and the facts that you have learned with the people that you know. There is so much to learn about this famous event and place that I urge you to research it for yourself. As always, if you like this video, I would encourage you to share it with others, and please vote for more history by giving it a like. This simple act can really help the channel out with the YouTube algorithm. I want to take a moment to thank all the people that have supported the channel by subscribing. Thank you. I would also like to urge new viewers or those that have not yet subscribed to please do so. It is free and it is something that is no cost to you. Be sure to click on the bell to receive all notifications for future videos. There is a lot more history left to explore. Well, that's all for now. So until the next time when I ask the question, did you know? I am Mr. Hodges, and this is the History Geek.